The mud of the Pontar Valley did not care for the politics of kings or the ambitions of emperors. It clung to the boots of the living and the dead alike, a thick gray slurry that smelled of copper, wood smoke, and the rot of a continent left to fester. Luna pulled her cloak tighter, the heavy wool soaked through by the relentless drizzle that had plagued the Iron Rose Company since they departed the ruins of Vizima. The Third Northern War was technically over. The Nilfgaardian sun had set behind the horizon of a tenuous peace treaty. But for a mercenary commander, the end of a war was simply the beginning of a different kind of slaughter. Deserters turned to banditry, villages turned to ash, and the zealots of the eternal fire turned their eyes toward anything they deemed unnatural to distract the starving masses from their empty bellies. "The scouts are back," a low, gravelly voice vibrated behind her. Luna didn't turn. She knew that voice better than her own heartbeat. Dominic, her second-in-command, her shield brother, and the only man she trusted to watch her back while she slept. "And," Luna asked, staring out over the fog-drenched valley, "is the pass clear?" Dominic stepped up beside her. He was a mountain of a man, even by the standards of the rugged north. His hair was a chaotic mane of dark brown, and his eyes, a piercing, unsettling amber, seemed to see through the mist in a way Luna's never could. He moved with a predatory grace that defied his heavy plate armor, his footsteps making no sound in the muck. "Clear of Nilfgaardians," Dominic said, his voice dropping an octave. "But the White Bridge is occupied. Eternal fire, a full contingent of witch hunters, led by a hierarch's legate. They're burning deviants in the square. They've blocked the road to Novigrad." Luna spat into the muck. "Fanatics. We can't afford a detour, Dominic. The men are exhausted, and our coin is running thin. If we don't reach the contract in Gorsvelen by the new moon,
we'll be eating our horses by winter." "We can't fight them, Luna," Dominic warned. His hand, scarred and massive, twitched toward the hilt of his silver-etched longsword. "Not with the way the wind is blowing. The locals are scared. They're feeding the pyres to save themselves. If we roll in there with 100 armed mercenaries, they'll call us heretics before we can draw steel." Luna finally looked at him. There was a tension in Dominic she hadn't seen before. It wasn't just the usual combat readiness. It was a physical strain, a tightness in his jaw that made the muscles of his neck cord like iron. The air around him felt thick, charged. "You're on edge," she noted, her voice softening. Dominic's gaze flickered to the darkening sky. The clouds were beginning to break, revealing a sliver of a pale, bloated moon. "It's a long road, Commander. That's all." Before Luna could press him, a giggle broke the heavy silence of the command tent's perimeter. A girl emerged from the shadows of the supply wagons. She was young, perhaps 19, with wide, doe-like eyes and a tumble of blonde curls that looked entirely too clean for a war-torn camp. This was Trixie, a camp follower who had attached herself to the Iron Rose 3 months ago. In the rigid, unspoken hierarchy of the pack-like mercenary company, Trixie was an Omega, soft, submissive, and constantly seeking the shadow of a stronger protector. Specifically, Dominic's shadow. "Master Dominic," Trixie chirped, scurrying forward. She held a small wooden bowl filled with wild berries, her fingers stained purple. "I found these by the creek. I thought, well, you look like you need your strength." She ignored Luna entirely, her eyes locked onto Dominic with a desperate, hungry intensity. She leaned in closer than was polite, her scent, sweet like crushed lilies and fear, wafting through the damp air. Dominic stiffened. A low, guttural sound, almost like a suppressed growl, vibrated in his chest. "Not now, Trixie."
Go back to the wagons." "But you haven't eaten since yesterday," Trixie persisted, her voice dropping to a seductive whimper. She reached out, her hand trembling as she tried to brush a lock of hair from his forehead. "You work too hard for us. Let me take care of." Dominic's hand shot out, catching her wrist with terrifying speed. He didn't hurt her, but the sheer force of his presence sent Trixie stumbling back, her berries spilling into the mud like drops of blood. "I said go," Dominic hissed. His eyes were no longer amber. For a fleeting second, they glowed with a terrifying lupine gold. Trixie whimpered, a sound of genuine submission and strange, twisted pleasure, and scrambled away into the darkness. Luna watched the girl go, then turned her sharp gaze back to her second-in-command. The air was suddenly cold. "Dominic, what was that?" "She's a distraction," he muttered, turning his back to Luna. He began to walk toward the tree line, his movements jagged, uncharacteristically frantic. "I'm going to scout the perimeter myself. Don't follow me." "The hell I won't," Luna snapped, her commander's instinct flaring. "You're acting like a wounded wolf, and we are in the middle of a hot zone. If you're compromised, I said stay back." Dominic's voice cracked, sounding less like a human man and more like a tectonic plate shifting. He broke into a run, disappearing into the dense black pines that bordered the camp. Luna didn't hesitate. She grabbed her sword belt, cinching it tight over her leather gambeson, and dived into the woods after him. She was a hunter by trade, trained in the tracking techniques of the blue stripes before she'd struck out on her own. She followed the sound of snapping branches and the heavy, rhythmic thud of feet. But the sounds changed. The thudding became faster. The rhythm shifted from 2 feet to 4. A sickening crunch of bone sliding against bone echoed through the trees, followed by the sound of fabric tearing like
a sail in a gale. Luna skidded to a halt in a small clearing. The moon had broken fully through the clouds now, bathing the grove in a harsh silver light. In the center of the clearing stood a creature out of a witcher's nightmare. It stood 7 feet tall on its haunches, a nightmare of silver-gray fur, corded muscle, and elongated claws. Its snout was wrinkled in a permanent snarl, revealing teeth that could snap a horse's spine. But it was the eyes that stopped Luna's heart. They were the same amber eyes she had looked into every morning for 5 years. "Dominic," she whispered, her hand frozen on the hilt of her sword. The werewolf froze. It turned its massive head, its ears twitching. A low, pained whine escaped its throat, a sound so humanly miserable it pierced Luna's chest deeper than any Nilfgaardian bolt. He lunged. Not at her, but away, crashing through the underbrush. But Luna was faster than she looked. She sprang forward, catching the tattered remains of his cloak that had snagged on a briar. "Dominic, stop," she commanded, her voice ringing with the authority that had led the Iron Rose through a dozen sieges. The beast skidded, turning to face her. It puffed out its chest, hair standing on end, let out a roar that shook the very needles from the pines. It was a warning, a territorial display of an alpha. Luna didn't flinch. She stepped into the beast's space, the scent of musk, wet fur, and ancient power hitting her like a physical blow. "I know it's you. Look at me." The werewolf's golden eyes searched hers. The predatory hunger was there, the instinct to kill, to rend, to dominate. But beneath it, buried under the curse, was the man who had shared his bread with her when they were starving in the trenches of Sodden. Slowly, the creature's shoulders slumped. It lowered its head, letting out a heavy, huffing breath. It took a tentative step toward her, its massive paw treading softly on the moss. It nudged its wet, cold nose against her palm. Luna's breath hitched. She didn't draw her blade. Instead, she ran her fingers through the coarse, thick fur of his neck. "Gods, Dominic," she breathed. "All this time." A twig snapped behind them. The werewolf whipped around, a vicious growl ripping from its throat. Luna spun, hand finally drawing her steel. Trixie stood at the edge of the clearing, her face pale, her eyes wide with a terrifying mixture of horror and realization. She wasn't looking at the monster with fear. She was looking at it with a feverish, obsessive awe. "An alpha," Trixie whispered, her voice trembling. "A real alpha." "Trixie, get back to camp," Luna ordered, her voice like ice. "Now, if you breathe a word of this." "You can't hide him forever, Commander," Trixie said, her voice gaining a sudden, sharp edge. She looked at Luna, the Omega's usual submissiveness replaced by a chilling calculation. "The eternal fire is 5 miles away. They have pyres for beasts like him. But they don't have to find him, not if he has someone who knows how to soothe him." The werewolf growled,
a sound of pure menace, but Trixie didn't move. She knew. She had seen the secret that could burn the iron rose to the ground. In the distance, the faint rhythmic tolling of a bell began to echo from the white bridge. The witch hunters were beginning their midnight prayers. Luna looked from the girl to the beast, realizing the war she had just survived was nothing compared to the one that was about to begin within her own ranks. The shadows of the trees seemed to lengthen, and for the first time in her life, Luna felt the cold weight of a secret that could cost her everything. "Dominic," she whispered, her hand still buried in his fur. "We have to move. Now." The werewolf looked at her, then at Trixie, his eyes burning with a hunger that was no longer just about blood. The hunt had begun, but the prey was no longer clear. Luna didn't wait for Trixie's consent. She lunged forward, grabbing,
tearing the younger woman by the collar of her gambeson and jerking her toward the darker shadows of the tree line. "One more word about soothing, and I'll leave your tongue for the crows," Luna hissed, her blade still leveled at the girl's throat. "Move. Now." Trixie stumbled, but her eyes never left the beast. Even as Luna shoved her toward the narrow deer path that led back toward the ruins of the old watchtower, Trixie's gaze remained fixed on the massive, fur-clad shape of Dominic. There was a hunger in her expression that made Luna's skin crawl, a desperate primal fascination that went beyond fear or loyalty. Dominic followed, his footfalls heavy but unnervingly silent on the damp moss. He moved with a predatory grace that defied his size, his shoulders rolling under the silver fur like waves on a storm-tossed sea. Every few paces he would pause, his head swiveling back toward the sound of the distant bells, his upper lip curling to reveal those devastating canines. The scent of him, ozone, musk, and something like old dried blood, clung to the air, making the hair on the back of Luna's neck stand on end. They pushed through a thicket of weeping willow, the branches scratching at Luna's face like skeletal fingers. The silver moonlight flickered through the canopy, creating a strobe effect that made Dominic's massive form look like a series of disjointed nightmares. "Where are we taking him?" Trixie whispered, her voice breathless. "The camp is too open. If the others see him." "The others won't see him," Luna snapped, though the lie felt like lead in her mouth. "There's a cellar beneath the watchtower, remnants of the old garrison. It's reinforced with granite." "You're going to cage him?" Trixie's voice rose, edged with a strange indignation. "It's a waste. He's not a prisoner, Commander. He's a god." Luna stopped so abruptly that Dominic nearly collided with her. She spun around, the tip of her sword catching the pale light.
It pressed against the soft skin of Trixie's neck. "He is my friend," Luna growled, her voice vibrating with a lethal low frequency. "He is a man cursed by a war we didn't ask for. If you speak of him as anything else, if you look at him like a prize one more time, I will end this conversation permanently. Do you understand?" Trixie swallowed hard, the blade drawing a tiny bead of crimson that looked black in the moonlight. For a second, her submissive mask slipped back into place, but the fire in her eyes remained. "Yes, Commander." A low, guttural vibration rumbled from Dominic's chest, a warning growl directed at the tension between the two women. He stepped between them, his massive head lowering, his amber eyes shifting from Luna to Trixie. He didn't snap, but the sheer pressure of his presence forced them apart. He was protecting Luna, yet his nostrils flared as he caught Trixie's scent, a cocktail of fear and arousal that the beast within him clearly found intoxicating. "Keep moving," Luna commanded, her heart hammering against her ribs. The path narrowed as they ascended the ridge toward the watchtower. The wind picked up, carrying the sharp, metallic tang of the eternal fire's incense from the white bridge. It was a smell Luna knew well, the smell of pyres and purification. The witch hunters wouldn't just kill Dominic, they would make an example of him. They would flay the fur from his bones while he still breathed, all in the name of their holy flame. As they reached the jagged remains of the stone tower, the shadow of the structure fell over them like a shroud. Luna felt a flicker of relief, but it was short-lived. From the darkness of the tower's arched entrance, a new sound emerged. Not a bell, and not the wind. It was the rhythmic clank of heavy plate armor and the unmistakable hiss of torches being struck.
Luna shoved Trixie behind a fallen pillar and signaled for Dominic to crouch. The werewolf dropped onto all fours, blending into the gray stone.
His breathing coming in shallow, hot huffs of steam. "Stay down," Luna breathed. A group of figures emerged from the tower's interior, their tabards emblazoned with the crimson sun of the eternal fire. At their head was a man in polished steel, his face hidden behind a grilled visor. He held a silver censer that smoked with a pungent, sickly sweet herb. "The scent is strong here," the knight said, his voice muffled but resonant. The beast passed through this way, and he wasn't alone. He paused, tilting his head toward the very pile of rubble where Luna and her secret were hiding. "I smell steel," the knight continued, his hand dropping to the hilt of a massive spyhander, "and I smell the sweat of a traitor." Luna's fingers tightened around the leather-wrapped hilt of her blade until her knuckles turned a ghostly white. Beside her, she felt the heat radiating off Dominic's body, a living furnace of suppressed violence. He had gone perfectly still, a statue of silver and shadow, his ears pinned back against his skull. The only sign of his agitation was the twitch of a single claw against the frost-cracked granite. "Come out, Commander," the knight called, his voice lacking the heat of anger. It was the cold, clinical tone of a butcher addressing a carcass. "You were always a poor hider. Even at the academy, you preferred the frontal assault to the tactical retreat." Luna recognized the voice. It was Sir Kalen, a man who had once been her mentor before the zealotry of the eternal fire had cauterized his humanity. She stepped out from behind the pillar, her posture rigid, her sword held low but ready. She didn't signal for Trixie or Dominic to follow. "Kalen, the White Bridge is a long way from the garrison. I didn't realize the High Inquisitor allowed his lapdog such a long leash." Kalen didn't flinch. He began to swing the silver censer in a slow, rhythmic arc. The smoke it emitted wasn't just sweet, it was cloying, thick with the oily residue. Crushed monkshood and silver nitrate. Behind him, 4 men-at-arms fanned out, their crossbows leveled at the shadows behind Luna. "We follow the scent of the blight, Luna, and the scent is screaming," Kalen said. He took a heavy step forward, the light of the torches reflecting in the grilled slits of his visor. "Move aside. Whatever you are shielding is no longer your friend. It is a hollowed-out shell filled with the great deceiver's filth." A low, vibrating throe started in the earth beneath Luna's boots. It wasn't the wind. It was Dominic. The smoke from the censer reached him, and his reaction was visceral. A choked, wet sound, half sob, half snarl, erupted from his throat. "Luna, the smoke!" Trixie hissed from the darkness, her voice trembling. "It's burning him!" "Silence," Luna commanded, but it was too late. Kalen's head snapped toward the source of Trixie's voice. With a fluid motion that belied the weight of his plate, he threw the censer. It struck the stone pillar near Dominic's head, shattering and releasing a concentrated cloud of the toxic incense. The reaction was instantaneous. Dominic let out a roar that shattered the silence of the rich, a sound of such pure, crystalline agony that it seemed to vibrate the very marrow of Luna's bones. He surged upward, no longer crouching, but standing on his hind legs, a 7-foot titan of fur and fury. The moonlight caught the silver-flecked foam at his jaws as he lunged into the light. "Loose!" Kalen shouted. The snap of crossbow strings echoed like cracking ice. Luna moved instinctively, her sword a blur as she parried a bolt meant for Dominic's chest, the metal sparking as the projectile was deflected into the dirt. But she couldn't catch them all. 2 bolts buried themselves in Dominic's shoulder and thigh. He didn't even slow down. The werewolf collided with the front line of men-at-arms like a falling mountain. One man was thrown 10 feet back into the tower wall, his breastplate caving
in with a sickening metallic crunch. Dominic's claws, long and curved like reaping hooks, tore through leather and chainmail as if it were parchment. "Dominic, no! Don't kill them!" Luna screamed. But the beast was in the ascendancy now, driven by the searing pain of the silver-laced smoke and the instinct to protect his mate. Kalen drew his Vihander, the 5-foot blade singing as it left the scabbard. "Traitorous bitch," he spat, stepping over the mangled remains of one of his men. "You've chosen a monster over your own kind, then you shall share his grave." He swung the massive sword in a horizontal arc designed to take Luna's head.
She dropped into a low roll, the wind of the blade whistling inches above her hair, and came up swinging. Her steel clashed against his, the vibration numbing her arms up to the elbows. Kalen was a mountain of a man, his strength augmented by the divine fervor of his order, but Luna was faster. She slipped inside his guard, aiming for the gap in his armpit, but a sudden flash of silver light blinded her. Kalen's armor was etched with runes of protection, and they flared with an unholy brilliance at the touch of her blade. Behind her, the slaughter continued. Dominic was a whirlwind of silver fur and crimson spray. He had pinned a second man-at-arms to the ground, his teeth buried in the man's throat, while his powerful hind legs disemboweled a third. "Luna!" Trixie's voice screamed, but it wasn't a warning. It was a call of distress. Luna risked a glance over her shoulder. The fourth man-at-arms had bypassed the carnage and grabbed Trixie by her hair, a dagger pressed to her throat. "Call him off, Commander!" The man shrieked, his eyes wide with terror as he watched Dominic turn his blood-soaked muzzle toward them. "Call the beast off or she dies!" Dominic froze. His golden eyes, now shot through with veins of angry red, locked onto the man holding Trixie. A terrifying intelligence flickered in those depths,
wrestling with the wolf for control. He took a step toward them, his claws clicking on the stone, a sound like a ticking clock in the sudden heavy silence. "Dominic, stay," Luna breathed, her eyes never leaving Kalen, who was repositioning for another strike. "Dominic, look at me." The werewolf's head tilted, his chest heaving, blood dripping from his jowls to stain the white dust of the ridge. For a heartbeat, the feral heat in his gaze softened, replaced by a devastating, human sorrow. Then Kalen lunged, not at Luna, but at the distracted Alpha. The greatsword cleaved the air with the weight of a falling guillotine. Luna's scream was a ragged shred of sound as she threw herself into the knight's path, her own blade rising in a desperate two-handed parry. She didn't try to stop the blow, that would have shattered her wrists, but instead angled her steel to slide against his. The impact was a bone-jarring thunderclap. Sparks showered the stone like dying stars as the Zweihander was deflected just enough to miss Dominic's spine. Instead, the heavy blade bit deep into the muscle of his haunch. Dominic's roar was no longer a sound of battle. It was a shriek of violated nature. The runes on Kalen's blade flared a sickly, searing white as they tasted werewolf blood, the holy enchantments cauterizing the wound even as they opened it. The beast collapsed to one side, his massive form skidding across the grit, leaving a smear of steaming, dark ichor behind. "Now, wretched thing!" Kalen roared, hauling his sword back for a finishing vertical stroke. "Run, Trixie!" Luna yelled, ignoring Kalen to lunge at the man holding the girl. But Trixie didn't wait. As the man-at-arms' attention flickered toward Kalen's strike, the girl slammed the back of her head into his nose. There was a wet crunch. As he recoiled, his grip loosening, she didn't flee. She reached into her bodice and pulled out a small glass vial filled with a shimmering violet dust, the volatile
agent she'd stolen from the apothecary weeks ago. She smashed it against the man's gorget. A concussive blast of amethyst flame erupted between them. The man-at-arms was thrown backward, his screams muffled by the sudden vacuum of the explosion. Trixie rolled away, her hair singed, her eyes wide with a manic, terrified triumph. The distraction gave Luna the opening she needed. She spun, her cloak billowing like a raven's wing, and drove her boot into the back of Kalen's knee. The knight grunted, his leg buckling under the weight of his plate. Dominic was already moving. The pain had pushed him past the threshold of sanity. The man named Dominic was gone, buried beneath layers of ancient predatory instinct. He didn't rise to his feet. He lunged from the ground, a coil of silver-gray muscle and hate. He ignored the burning gash in his leg, his jaws snapping shut on Kalen's sword arm. The sound of steel being crushed followed. Kalen's scream was cut short as the Alpha swung him like a rag doll, slamming the armored knight into the base of the stone pillar. The impact cracked the masonry. "Dominic, stop!" Luna reached for him, her hand hovering inches from the matted fur of his shoulder. "He's finished. Don't let the blood take you." Dominic turned. The transformation was shifting again, driven by the sheer adrenaline of the kill. His snout was shortening, his brow thickening, but his teeth remained jagged daggers. He looked at Luna, and for a terrifying second, she saw nothing but the hunger of the void. His lips pulled back, revealing gums stained crimson. He lowered his head, a low, tectonic rumble vibrating in his chest.
Kalen, slumped against the pillar, coughed a spray of blood into his visor. His sword arm hung at a useless, mangled angle, but his left hand fumbled for a small silver whistle hanging from a chain around his neck. "You think you've won," Kalen wheezed, the sound bubbling through the gore in his throat. He pressed the
whistle to his lips. No sound emerged, at least nothing human ears could detect. Dominic's reaction was immediate. He dropped to his knees, his hands, half claws, half fingers, clutching at his ears. He let out a whimper that tore at Luna's heart, a high-pitched sound of pure agony that made him curl into a fetal ball. "What is that?" Trixie shouted, stumbling toward them, her face soot-streaked. "What's he doing to him?" "The silver frequency," Luna hissed, her eyes darting to the tree line below the ridge. "He's not alone." From the shadows of the forest, more shapes emerged. Not men-at-arms this time, but the hound masters of the order, men draped in wolf pelts, leading massive charcoal-gray mastiffs whose eyes glowed with the same unnatural light as Kalen's runes. Behind them, a dozen archers notched arrows tipped with shimmering glass heads. The censer was the bait, Luna realized, her stomach dropping. They didn't come to kill him here. They came to break him. Kalen let the whistle fall, a jagged, bloody grin visible through his shattered visor. "The church doesn't waste a prime specimen, Commander. We need a new warhound for the front. And you have provided us with the perfect pedigree." The archers raised their bows in a synchronized motion. Dominic looked up, his golden eyes weeping blood, his gaze finding Luna's. In that moment of shared agony, the beast receded just enough for his voice to crack through, a dry, rasping whisper that barely carried over the wind. "Luna, run." "No," Luna said, her voice a low, dangerous vibration that matched the growl in Dominic's chest. As the archers released their bows to fire, Luna didn't move toward Kalen. She moved toward Trixie. She snatched the girl's satchel, feeling the clinking of half a dozen unstable glass vials. "Trixie, the catalyst, the blue one," Luna commanded. Trixie, eyes streaming with tears but hands steadying with a newfound iron will, fished
out a deep azure flask. "It needs a spark, Luna, a big one." "Dominic!" Luna screamed, not a plea but a command. "The pillar! Give me the spark!" Dominic's eyes cleared for a fraction of a second. He understood. He lunged, not at the archers, but at the cracked stone pillar where Kalen slumped. He didn't use his claws. He slammed his massive silver-furred shoulder into the masonry while simultaneously dragging his metal-shod claws across the flint-heavy base. A shower of sparks erupted just as Luna hurled the satchel into the air above the houndmasters. Trixie threw the azure catalyst with the precision of a street urchin who had spent years throwing stones at city guards. The collision was cataclysmic. The violet dust combined with the blue catalyst in a pressurized vacuum, ignited by Dominic's sparks. A shockwave of cobalt and amethyst fire roared outward. It wasn't just heat, it was an alchemical erasure. The glass-tipped arrows disintegrated in midair. The mastiffs broke their tethers, their unnatural conditioning shattered by the sheer primal force of the blast, and turned on their masters in a panicked frenzy. The ridge became a hellscape of colored smoke and screams. Luna moved through the haze like a ghost. She reached Kalen before he could crawl away. He looked up at her, his visor gone, showing a face pale with the realization that he had miscalculated the one thing the church could never quantify, the desperation of those with nothing left to lose. "The Order will hunt you to the ends of the earth," Kalen wheezed. "Let them," Luna whispered, her blade hovering over the seal on his throat. "I've spent my life leading men into darkness. I think it's time I let the darkness back to you." She didn't kill him. Instead, she took the silver whistle from the dirt and crushed it into his open palm, grounding the metal into his flesh with her boot. "Tell your bishop that the Alpha is no longer a specimen. He is a king, and we are coming for them."
A throne. She turned away, leaving the broken knight to the mercy of his own retreating men. Dominic stood in the center of the clearing. The fur was receding, the jagged teeth shrinking back into a human jaw, but the golden glow in his eyes remained, steady, sentient, and calm. He was no longer a beast, nor just a man. He was the synthesis of both. He reached out a shaking hand. Luna took it, her fingers interlocking with his. Trixie stepped up beside them, her face smudged with soot, a jagged grin on her face, as she clutched a final small vial she'd hidden in her sleeve. "So," the girl chirped, though her voice trembled. "Where to now? I heard the north is nice this time of year. Lots of places for people like us to disappear." Dominic looked at the horizon, where the spires of the high city pierced the dawn, the seat of the order, the source of their misery. "We aren't disappearing," Dominic said, his voice deep and resonant, no longer a rasp. The church spent centuries trying to create the perfect weapon. It's time they saw what it looks like when that weapon chooses its own target. Luna looked at the girl, then at the man she loved, and finally at the path ahead. The fear that had defined her life for years had evaporated in the amethyst flames. "The north can wait," Luna agreed, her voice ringing with the finality of a death knell. "We're going to the capital. We're going to finish this." They walked off the ridge together as the sun rose, 3 shadows against the light: the commander, the alchemist, and the alpha. Leaving the burning remnants of the order behind them, the hunt was over. The revolution had begun. The descent into the valley was a blur of silver-gray mist, and the pungent, lingering scent of ozone that clung to their clothes like a second skin. For the first hour, no one spoke. The adrenaline that had fueled their defiance was cooling now, leaving behind a hollow, thrumming ache in their bones, and the scorched earth,
a taste of alchemical fire in the back of their throats. Luna kept her hand firmly in Dominic's, her thumb tracing the line of his pulse. It was slow and powerful, a rhythmic, subterranean beat that felt less like a human heart and more like the ticking of a tectonic plate. He didn't stumble once, despite the uneven terrain. The frantic, twitching energy of the beast had smoothed out into a terrifyingly efficient grace. He moved through the undergrowth without snapping a single twig, his gaze sweeping the tree line with a predatory focus that made the hair on the back of Luna's neck stand up. He was no longer fighting the wolf. He was wearing it. Trixie trailed slightly behind them, her small shoulders hunched. She was busy with a needle and thread, frantically trying to stitch a tear in her satchel while walking, a testament to her nervous compulsion to keep her tools ready. Every few minutes she would glance back at the ridge, where the orange glow of the dying fires silhouetted the skeletal remains of the watchtower. "They'll send the Seekers next," Trixie whispered, her voice cracking the silence. She didn't look up from her stitching. Kaelin was just the leash holder. The Seekers, they don't use dogs, they use the blood. "Let them bleed," Dominic said. His voice was a rich, low resonance that seemed to vibrate in Luna's very marrow. It wasn't a growl, but the threat of one lived in the harmonics of every word. He stopped, turning his head toward the wind. "The air is changing. There's a storm rolling in from the coast. It'll wash away our scent and the ash of the ridge. It's a 3-day trek to the Blackwater crossing if we stay off the main merchant veins." Luna looked at him, her brow furrowing. "You know the way. You haven't been this far south since the campaign in the marches." Dominic's golden eyes settled on hers, and for a heartbeat, she saw the man she had known years ago, the weary soldier who had shared sour wine and bitter jokes in the trench.
Yes, then the pupils narrowed, cat-like, reflecting the bruised purple of the pre-dawn sky. "I don't know the way by the maps, Luna," he murmured, his grip on her hand tightening just enough to be felt. "I know it by the pull of the earth, the iron in the soil, the way the water flows toward the high city. It's like a bell ringing in my skull. The closer we get to the Cathedral of the Vales, the louder it gets." He reached out his free hand, brushing a streak of soot from Luna's cheek. His skin was unnaturally warm, radiating a feverish heat that spoke of a metabolism rewritten by the church's forbidden crucibles. "We need supplies," Luna said, forcing her mind back to the cold reality of logistics. The commander in her was reclaiming the territory of her thoughts. "We're low on food, your clothes are rags, and Trixie's vials are mostly empty glass. There's a village, Oakhaven, a few miles past the crossing. The locals there have no love for the Order's tithe collectors. We can find a contact I used during the rebellion. Oak Haven is a trap, Trixie interjected, finally looking up. Her eyes were wide, the pupils blown. The bishop's men started setting up purification stations in the border towns last month. If we walk in there looking like this, scorched, bloody, and, well, with him looking like a god of the woods, we'll be in a cage before we can buy a loaf of bread. Luna looked at Dominic, then at her own tattered uniform, the sigils of her former rank ripped away. They were a trio of ghosts, a collage of trauma and forbidden science. Then we don't walk in, Dominic decided. His gaze shifted toward the distant, jagged silhouette of the Iron Mountains that guarded the approach to the capital. We hunt. We take what we need from the patrols. If the bishop wants to turn me into a weapon, I should start practicing my purpose. He stepped toward a thicket of ancient briars, his movements fluid and silent. He didn't push the branches aside. He seemed
to melt through them. "Luna," he called softly from the shadows of the trees. She followed, Trixie close at her heels. In a small clearing, shielded by a canopy of weeping willow, Dominic stopped. He knelt, pressing his palm to the damp earth. A low hum escaped his throat, a sound that wasn't quite human. To Luna's shock, the nearby flora seemed to react, the leaves shivering, the very shadows deepening around him. "They didn't just put a wolf inside me," Dominic whispered, looking at his hands as the moonlight caught the faint silvery scar lines of the Order's glyphs etched into his skin. "They opened a door to something much older. I can feel the city, Luna. I can feel the thousands of souls trapped under the bishop's thumb. They're crying out for someone to break the glass." He stood up, his stature seemingly growing in the gloom. The exhaustion that should have been crushing him seemed to have been consumed, burned away by the inner fire of his transformation. "Trixie," he said, turning to the girl, "how many of the black sulfur charges do you have left?" Trixie blinked, startled. "Only 2, and the reagents are unstable. Why?" Dominic looked toward the south, where the first light of dawn was hitting the highest spire of the distant capital, a needle of white stone that looked like a fang against the sky. "Because we aren't going to Oak Haven for bread," he said, a dark, predatory smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "We're going to the Blackwater garrison. They have the horses we need, the armor Luna requires, and enough black powder to make sure the bishop hears us coming long before we reach his gates." Luna felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the morning chill. She saw the path ahead, not one of quiet shadows and narrow escapes, but a trail of fire and broken iron. She reached for the hilt of her blade, her fingers finding the familiar coldness of the steel. "To the garrison, then," she said, her voice steady. "Let's see if the Order remembers how to bleed." The trek toward the Blackwater garrison was not a journey of miles, but of shifting elevations and sharpening intent. As the sun climbed, shedding its bruised violet for a harsh, pale gold, the landscape surrendered its greenery to the jagged gray teeth of the foothills. The air grew thin, tasting of wet slate and the distant, acrid tang of coal fire. Dominic led the way, his pace tireless. He didn't walk so much as flow over the uneven terrain, his boots barely disturbing the frost-crusted scree. Luna watched the muscles of his back ripple beneath his shredded shirt. He was leaner than he had been before his capture, his frame rewoven into something meant for efficiency rather than bulk. Every few hundred yards he would pause, his nostrils flaring, tilting his head as if listening to a frequency only he could hear. "The wind is changing," he said, not turning around. "The garrison is 2 miles ahead. I can smell the horses and the oil they use to grease the portcullis." Luna caught up to him, her hand instinctively hovering near the empty sheath at her hip where her command saber once rested. "Blackwater is built into a natural limestone shelf," she whispered, her tactical memory clicking into place. "It's a funnel, one way in, one way out. They use it to intercept smugglers coming through the pass. If we go in the front, we're target practice for the crossbowmen on the ramparts." "We aren't going in the front," Trixie muttered, stumbling slightly over a loose stone. She was clutching her satchel to her chest like a holy relic,
her face pale. "If we're using the black sulfur, we need a vent, a kitchen flue or a forge chimney, something that pulls air inward. The sulfur doesn't just explode, Luna. It displaces oxygen. It makes the lungs forget how to work." Dominic stopped at the edge of a precipice. Below them, nestled in a shadowed gorge where the sun hadn't yet reached, lay the garrison. It was a grim, octagonal structure.
Of basalt and iron, the banners of the order, a weeping eye over a closed book, snapping in the cold updraft. "There," Dominic pointed. His finger didn't tremble. "The forge. See the black smoke? They're shoeing horses for the morning patrol." He turned to Luna, and for a moment, the predatory stillness in his eyes softened. The man she had loved, the man who had quoted poetry in the mud of the trenches, flickered behind the golden iris. "You need your steel, Luna, and Trixie needs her peace. I can give you both, but the man who does it won't be the one you remember." "I don't see a monster, Dom," Luna said, her voice low and fierce. She reached out, her fingers tracing the silver glyphs on his forearm. They felt like cold wires beneath the skin. "I see a reckoning." They descended the slope with the silence of falling shadows. Luna took point as they reached the perimeter, utilizing the drainage culverts she knew were standard in such fortifications. The smell of the garrison hit them, manure, stale ale, and the oppressive, sterile scent of the church's incense, which the soldiers burned to ward off spiritual rot. As they reached the rear wall of the forge, the heat became a physical weight. The rhythmic clink-clank of a hammer on an anvil echoed through the stone, masked by the roar of the bellows. Dominic signaled for them to wait. He scaled the rough-hewn basalt wall with terrifying ease, his fingers finding purchase in cracks no wider than a coin. He reached the high, narrow window of the forge and vanished inside. Seconds passed, then a minute. Luna's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. She gripped a jagged shard of stone, ready to spring, when the heavy iron-bound door of the forge creaked open. Dominic stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the orange glow of the furnace. He was wiping a dark, viscous smear from his knuckles. Behind him, the blacksmith lay slumped over his anvil, not dead, but deep in a sleep that
looked unnaturally heavy. "The way is clear," Dominic said, his voice vibrating with that strange, low hum. "Trixie, the vent is above the main bellows. Luna, look on the weapon rack, the third locker." Luna stepped into the heat and soot. She ignored the racks of standard-issue pikes and moved to the locker. With a sharp kick, she broke the lock. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a long sword of folded Valerian steel, its pommel shaped like a rising sun, her own blade, stripped from her the night of the purge. She unsheathed it, the ring of the metal singing through the room like a choir. The weight was perfect. The balance was home. "They kept it as a trophy," she whispered, the cold steel reflecting the firelight. "Everything they have is a trophy," Dominic replied, stepping toward the inner door that led to the main barracks. He looked back at Trixie, who was precariously perched on a stool, pouring a shimmering charcoal-colored powder into the forge's ventilation system. "When that ignites, the air in the barracks will turn to lead. They'll be unconscious in minutes." "And then?" Trixie asked, her voice trembling as she struck a flint. Dominic's shadow lengthened against the wall, stretching toward the door, turning the shape of a man into something jagged and long-limbed. "And then," he said, his voice dropping an octave, "we take the horses and leave the bishop a message written in the ashes of his own pride."